you're looking at the smallest entity in that organization, the individual contributor, for example, and seeing what is the psychological and environment they need, what is the information environment they need, what's the cultural environment they need, the work environment they need to be maximally effective and maximally creative and maximally engaged in their job. And that's the challenge, I think, for organizations. Hi, I'm Andrew Davis.
And I'm Steve Pereira.
And this
is the Value Stream Show.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Value Stream Show. I'm Andrew Davis, joined by my co-host, Steve Pereira. And so today we'd like to talk about value streams versus org charts. This is a topic, it was probably the first thing that Steve and I started discussing in great depth when we started meeting together, is this value streams versus org charts. Steve, do you want to frame the debate for us or clarify this?
Yeah, I think, what really resonated with us when we were talking about this initially was how the model for organizations that we most commonly leverage is this kind of static, hierarchical, inflexible structure that doesn't represent how work actually happens. And, if you're coming from a pursuit of improved development and delivery performance, if you're curious about how do we improve the flow of value to customers or our performance as a team, and you're curious about how value streams kind of factor into that, you'll notice that the org chart really works against all of the things that we're aiming for when we're talking about flow and value streams, because it's kind of this inverted tree that's very good at laying out who should report to who owns what functions are kind of organized into the structure of the organization. From what we know about value streams, there's a lot of different functions involved in delivering value to a customer for a typical product. And it's very seldom to have that you have all of those things kind of represented in one team. You often have to go bouncing around the org chart in order to get something out to customers. So, we were kind of initially mocking this up and having conversations with a visual representation of an org chart and, the line of value or the line of work kind of snaking through, and then talking about how if you were organized into value streams or if you were organized for flow, you would be able to understand your work as it exists in something closer to reality, right? Instead of trying to model what's happening onto an org chart and doing some kind of translation, we could use a value stream to kind of model something closer to reality, something closer to how we perceive the work to be and how we think the work should flow across the organization.
I think our original conversations were like, well, at least for me, the theme that kept arising was the org chart is an outdated way of thinking about businesses, and we need to replace it with something very new. Everything structured around value streams, and it gave me a lot of opportunity to contemplate what's the actual function of an org chart, and I've backtracked from that early conclusion in a lot of ways, but fundamentally, I guess the reason I think about the org chart a lot is it is the primary visual representation of the company. Like, if you want to understand the company, aside from the logo or the buildings, how do you understand the company? What does it look like? Well, the best map that I see on a day-to-day basis is the org chart, this hierarchical structure that shows basically how people fit together and what role they're playing in the organization. What it is it is in fact a visualization of this invisible social network. There is, some agreed upon structure, like I report to so-and-so and they report to somebody else. But fundamentally, those interpersonal relationships and those obligations, they're invisible. And what we're doing is we're mapping this invisible social structure to try to give form to something that's fundamentally invisible. It's just a bunch of people. If an outside observer were to watch us just all assembling in a room back in the days when you used to have rooms and offices, or were joining a webinar, a video conference, an outside observer wouldn't know the relationships between the various people, and they wouldn't know why a certain person got to speak more than other people, and why a certain person got to interrupt other people more than other people, and so forth. The people involved in that, we're very socially conscious. We're very aware of the power structures in the organization, and so then we're deferential to the people we should be deferential to, and mildly abusive or disrespectful to the people we feel we have no where we feel like that's our role. And one of the first really powerful insights that I had is that the customer is not depicted anywhere on the org chart. They simply don't exist on the org chart. They're just not on that map. And so you've got a map of the company that doesn't show the customer. It is as if the entire company exists in space with one person at the very center, right? CEO, say, and of course, it's invisible on the org chart, but they know that they're beholden to the board of directors, so, and to their spouse probably, and to their kids and all of the other folks that they work for. But the customer's not on there, and so what kind of decisions do we make if we're making decisions primarily based on the power structure that is vested in the org chart? We make decisions that are based around power and social hierarchy and social status and so forth. And so you and I talked a lot about some of these behaviors, like, social climbing that emerge, where you're just trying to do things to get a promotion or do things to impress your boss or whatever. And none of those things are tuned to optimizing the benefit that you're delivering to the customer. None of them are particularly tuned towards being responsive to the customer. And you may have corporate values, customer success, or customer responsiveness, customer obsession if you're Amazon. But then the question is, are those values that actually inform your decisions on a day-to-day basis if the world that you believe that you're living in is a world of an org chart? And you actually don't meet a customer because you're somewhere in the middle of the process. You're a QA tester, so you haven't never seen a customer. Maybe a problem there. But like, if you're deeply embedded in the organization, you're not directly customer facing. Who do you work for? What are you doing? What's the purpose of this? It feels like it's easy for it to feel like your job is to keep showing up day after day and not get fired. And everything finally comes down to how your boss and your boss's boss feel about you. And that is important, but it's certainly not the main story or the whole story. And it's certainly, if that's the only thing we think about, it creates massive dysfunctions.
We've sort of seen a lot of examples of how the org chart steering the organization that leads to this kind of calcification over time, and reinforcing behaviors and reinforcing boundaries that are not conducive to positive customer outcomes and even positive employee outcomes. And one of the ones that comes to mind to me all the time that I see when dealing with other companies and talking to people who are inside of large organizations is how the org chart starts shaping how people organize, how people work. And even, the most surprising and most recent revelation for me was the sort of formation of company goals and targets and things like OKRs. And I have this theory about how organizations slow down over time based on the power of the org chart, like shaping how the organization works. Because when you're a startup, you have some big audacious goal, and the entire organization is sort of directed towards that, right? It's kind of you pick your target, and then everyone contributes to making that happen. And they kind of organize themselves to enable it, right? To make sure that it happens. And then you succeed and you grow and you tackle, new opportunities, and you sort of naturally scale. And as that happens, you sort of, okay, well, let's organize into groups. And if you organize into things like functions, and meaning that, let's put the software engineers with software engineers so that they can train each other, and they're led by a software engineer who has the most experience, and they'll sit together, and we want them to kind of work together. And we also want the benefits of scale so that, if one person's not available, we can go to another person and easily do that. And then you have tech in one silo, you might have product in another silo, you might have design in another silo. And then eventually you get to a point where, all these, no one knows what they're doing, and they have to kind of set targets to be clear about, here's what we're going to try and do. We have these ambitious goals. We've succeeded, so we have fundraising, we have a board, we're trying to hit all these targets. So let's come up with OKRs, or let's, set objectives. And what happens is when that happens inside of those silos, then you kind of get OKRs and targets and objectives that kind of serve the silo, right? Because they're kind of serving their own interests based on their own context, right? What are the things that we can do as engineering to try and improve customer outcomes? Well, let's look at what we're capable of, how many staff we have, what we're doing right now, what would good look like for us. And so you can very easily start to see OKRs kind of formed within a silo. And all of a sudden, tech is aiming for, okay, we're going to be 30% better at X or Y. And they're kind of serving their own roadmap instead of taking a customer outcome or some kind of value and reorganizing towards delivering that, much like a startup would. I think a high functioning organization would retain that ability to sort of reorganize around customer outcomes. And you see this in a lot of the highest performing organizations. Things like Amazon does, 2 pizza teams, you own a product, you're kind of responsible for end-to-end delivery, stand it up, make it happen. In the video game industry, they come out of project-based operations. So they would sort of like grab a bunch of people and put them in, delivering a video game, which is of course more project-based, but at least you had everybody kind of pulling towards one target outcome. And I think that we could borrow a lot of that power of alignment and flow by leveraging something like a value stream model and looking at more horizontal organizational models. Not meaning that you have to throw away the org chart, but sort of adding this layer of flow across it and understanding that the org chart isn't how work happens. The value stream is how work happens.
So we've been talking about enabling development teams to have greater impact on their business. So I want to pause briefly to talk about the next generation of development teams and to thank our sponsor, Copado. Copado's focus is on bringing the power of DevOps to low-code platforms such as Salesforce, ServiceNow, and SAP. The world of development is changing fast. And a lot of the IT innovation happening in our organizations now is being done on these low-code platforms and being done by people who may not have a traditional software development background. So the challenge is that these systems are becoming incredibly complex. So low-code development may be easy to begin with and easier to get started with, but when you're dealing with dozens or even hundreds of contributors working over the course of months and years, you pretty quickly reach a scale where you need things like version control, automated deployments, automated testing, and value stream management. So that's where Copado helps as the leading DevOps and testing platform for low-code. So if you're managing a platform like Salesforce, ServiceNow, or SAP, check them out at copado.com, get a demo, and find tons of other resources. Now back to our show. And I think your point about not necessarily throwing away the org chart, that was one of the adjustments that I came back to, is realizing that the part of the challenge is trying to maximize in one direction or another, or saying which of these is the absolute right answer and so forth. And the point is that all of these structures provide functions. They perform functions, and they're there for a reason. And the org chart, for example, extraordinarily, fundamentally, it comes back to the simplest of all human networks, family structures, and so forth. That there's some kind of a hierarchy, whether it's age-based or whatever. So, and simple network diagram, where things start with a common trunk and then they branch out, and depending on the size of your organization, you've got more levels in the org chart. But it basically creates a a network branching diagram like that is a very efficient structure for, for the flow of, to take the cybernetics term, for the flow of communication and control, or information and power. But if you maximize towards any of these, if you think the org chart's the only thing that's real, or the value stream's the only thing that's real, and so forth, or the people's skill sets are the only thing that's real, et cetera, so forth, it's easy to miss a lot of key points, and easy to optimize around the wrong things, and undervalue other things. I think back to when I was a consultant, we had a matrixed organization. So I reported into the software development teams, and similarly, we had QA teams and so forth. And you have this clustering, exactly like you said before, clustering of skills where people can learn from each other, train each other, mentor each other, and you can swap people in and out. And there's a benefit to that. But then we were matrixed into each consulting project. We had a project manager and account manager and so forth that would lead each of those projects. And there's a benefit to that. But one thing we were not looking at is the actual effectiveness, the characteristics of the value stream that are, performance tuning around that value stream, and looking at the specific handoffs from one role to another. So I think even if you have a matrixed organization where, okay, I've got a project leader and I've got my discipline leader, you still need to be, there's still something missing that the value stream, I think, aims to provide, which is this measurement, for example, the concrete representation of the handoff. It's not just who's the leader, who's the boss in some kind of an amorphous way. You actually see, first this has to happen, then this has to happen, and here we have problems and have to get things sent back, and here's where there's a long waiting process. And you begin to optimize around that, the delivery to the customer, and you begin to optimize around that, those handoffs of work from one person to another, from one group to another. And I guess the last point that I'd mention is that you said that some of our goal would be to approximate the richness of mission focus that a small startup has. So small startup, relatively, 5, 10, 20, 30 people, how do they operate versus how does the large organization operate? What's the difference? What comes to mind for me when I think about a small startup is the richness of communication networks, where it's not hard to communicate to everybody. It's not hard to be aware of what's happening. So you have a knowledge of what other people are working on. You have a knowledge of who the customer is. You've probably met the customer. And the larger the organization gets, the more that information gets diluted. And if I think about, Jeffrey West wrote this book called Scale, and he talks about the terminal units of biological entity, or the terminal units of a company. The terminal units of a biological entity are the individual cells, and they each need to get oxygen through the circulatory system. The terminal units of an organization are people. And each of those people, what are the nutrients that they need to survive? Well, they need to get paid, but also they need to have clarity about what they're doing and how they can get their work done. And they need to have a basis to be inspired by the mission of what is their role in the organization. There needs to be something that activates those intrinsic motivators, like purpose, autonomy, and mastery, and so forth. So you need to be thinking of an organization in such a way that you're looking at the smallest entity in that organization, the individual contributor, for example, and seeing what is the psychological and environment they need, what is the information environment they need, what's the cultural environment they need, the work environment they need to be maximally effective and maximally creative and maximally engaged in their job. And that's the challenge, I think, for organizations. We have to think both at that small scale, but as well try to do what an org chart is good at, which is really scaling things up, right? And so you have to optimize around two different things. Optimize around the individual, the experience, the mental environment of the individual contributor to maximize their capacity, but as well optimize on a larger scale. And that's where breaking things into, small product teams and, sub teams and so forth begins to become so powerful.
So I think that naturally brings us into talking about things like platforms, and how you could split this concept of value streams into something like what team topologies talks about, where you have streamline teams, and you kind of support scaling to multiple streamlined teams by providing kind of core shared functionality in terms of platforms.
It's interesting. Manuel Pace just shared that they'd had 70,000 sales of that book so far, which, if you're not familiar with it, for a tech book, that is a whole lot of books for a technical book. And I guess the teetering at the edge of slipping into this topic. But the thing that's so powerful about that is that it provided guidance for technical leaders about these very social and human things, about team design and human cognitive capacity, and those have not, those have been the domains of the HR departments, for example, or the domains of the executive leaders, and the IT teams have been more concerned with server configurations and network configurations and traffic load balancers and these kinds of things. But we're realizing that, as you said earlier, right, the constraint that we've hit is not a technical constraint. The constraint we've hit is on human capacity, human interaction, human motivation, attention span, and that we need to design these social systems and technical systems together in concert with one another. And so I guess veering us back into the main topic here, org charts versus value streams. I don't know, Steve, you want to speak to some strengths and weaknesses of org charts and value streams both?
Sure. I think that my suspicion is that you could organize an entire organization by value streams, but that intuition lacks evidence because there are so few organizations that actually operate that way. And I'm in, the very, very early stages of doing research into real world implementations of kind of stream alignment and organizing as streams rather than org charts. When I think about ways that we could organize, the default model of the value stream, like identifying a customer, identifying value, working backwards, and facilitating flow of work out to that customer, seems like such a natural model for positive outcomes and performance and flow and maximizing individual contribution. And the org chart, though, is very useful in having people understand who to go to get help and to improve their individual performance. I think that having a clear leader and an escalation path helps individuals feel like I have someone to go to. I have a very clear definition of relationships that I need to develop and foster and maintain. I don't necessarily have to know everyone's life all the time and communicate with everyone in the organization all the time either. I have kind of hopefully a manageable Dunbar's number, right? A manageable number of folks that I need to stay close with, collaborate with at any given time. And that kind of helps me manage my cognitive load and manage, my responsibility load. I kind of know who I need to make happy, and I know hopefully what I need to do in order to check all the boxes that I need to check for my, personal performance. And I think that's really valuable for folks because you could think of a value stream example on the other side of do whatever it takes to deliver optimal customer outcomes, perhaps providing a degree of uncertainty about what's it actually going to take to do that, what's enough, where do we set the boundaries on what is kind of reasonable and expected. And so I think that the simplicity of an org chart can give folks a little bit of assurance that the system that we've been operating under for a very long time, which is somewhat predictable and static and reliable, can give folks a little bit of clarity on the operating model of the organization.
The org chart provides a central coherence to the organization that I think is important on one level, to decide, each each streamlined team might even go as far as having its own profit and loss and its own metrics and so forth. But even I think you and I both look to Amazon as a company that has done an amazing job of trying to optimize around these small teams, the effectiveness of these small two pizza teams. At the same time, there's an org chart, right? AWS has an org chart, and Amazon has an org chart, and so forth. It's clearly providing some complementary function for that organization. And if you think about Amazon.com, the retail site, and you think you've got these various two pizza teams, and one of them is just in charge of the ordering buttons, and another one is just in charge of like the product recommendation things and so forth. Nevertheless, as the consumer experiences, a consumer still needs to have a coherent experience when you go to the website. There needs to be a sense that these things fit together in some way, and that can be one role for taking a higher level look at what's missing from our platform. Is there something that Walmart's rolling out that Amazon doesn't have, and we need to compete to add that in. And I guess the other analogy that comes to mind, and going back to Jeffrey West's book Scale, he talks about two very distinct models that all networked structures haven't take. They sort of diverge into two very different models. One is the organism model, where there is a central coherent organism that survives for a length of time, maybe reproduces and so forth. And the other is a city model. And the mathematics on these two are very different, but corporations, when he did his initial research, it looks like corporations follow the organism structure in general. So, which means that corporations necessarily die, that all corporations grow, age, and die. And they die partly because they're not able to innovate quickly enough to keep up with other fast-growing, innovative organizations, which certainly aligns with what we see these days in the market. But the city analogy, he makes the point that it's very hard to destroy a city, even a city like Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or cities that have had enormous fires and so forth. They all come back, and there's a very different structure to the city, which is this radical decentralization, where there is not really a central planning. There are some central facilities, trash pickup and water and electricity and so forth, that are necessary for the functioning of the city, but individual entities are businesses and individuals are operating very much autonomously, and this sort of veering us into Matthew Parker's book Radical Enterprise, and the idea of new ways of imagining businesses that are much more decentralized than today's business. I don't think we have time to go into any of that now, but it is interesting to see this evolution as corporations are becoming basically rivals to the nation state. Will we see a version of radical decentralization within organizations where the corporation ends up playing the same role that the state plays today, which is providing some general common infrastructure, health insurance plans and so forth, and then that's it. And then all the value stream aligned teams are kind of have their own profit and loss and are operating, in a competitive marketplace. Who knows?
This is indeed veering us into interesting territory, because it's brought me to think about one of my favorite books, which I think I've talked to you about, Snow Crash, which is all about the future, this dystopian future where corporations run everything, and everybody sort of lives in a corporate city, and autonomy and decentralization are kind of like dialed to the extreme. But as time goes on, I'm increasingly convinced that that's where we'll end up. But I think it's to this point of decentralization and autonomy being resilient patterns, right? We know that if you break things into small parts, if you arrange them fractally, if you connect things as a network, if you ensure that communication patterns are strong, if you ensure that those functional parts or components are reconstitutable and repurposable in various configurations, like a cell, for instance, the ultimate cell, the stem cell, could sort of mold itself to be any cell that's kind of required. and having, a biological entity made up of these tiny building blocks that are largely the same, just configured in various ways. I think we're learning a lot about how to create and craft and run organizations from looking at biological systems and then systems of community, or maybe we'll say informal networks, right? You've spent some time thinking about informal networks. How do you see value streams kind of overlaying or interplaying with this idea of an informal network?
There is this other aspect. There's the formal structure of a community, and then there's the informal relationships. The idea of a voluntary community where people come together and they like Stack Overflow or something like that, where people just coming and volunteering and creating a marketplace of answers and questions, and what attracts people to these informal communities for the exchange of value. I think we can definitely see the organization has these characteristics, both of formal social networks, but also the informal social networks of trust and enthusiasm and exchange of value. And so clearly we need a well-functioning, healthy organization will have a very rich informal social network. People enjoy each other's company, wanting to help each other, wanting to optimize performance of the organization together. But anyway, really another rich session. We've opened up all kinds of new topics for us to explore in further sessions. But glad again to spend time with you today on the Value Stream Show. So thank you very much, and until next time.
Thanks for joining us. Please rate, review, and share the podcast. And make sure to visit us at valuestreamshow.com to sign up for our newsletter and find show notes, episodes, and more.